This is avoiding enforcement. So incapacity, avoiding enforcement of a contract. It could be incapacity, bargaining misconduct, unconscionability, and public policy, although we're only going to get to part of that. Yeah. So the first is the minority and mental capacity, duress, and undue influence. So these are defenses to contract enforcement. So a little bit of an overview first. Maybe I should do this every time we go through it. That'll help me remember. Okay, so defense to contract enforcement. There are two types. There is the failure of formation of a contract, and this goes to the competency of the parties and the lack of true mutual assent. And then there's the refusal of law to enforce the substance of an agreement, and that's public policy. So like hitmen can't sue to get their money from a contract because public policy is like, no, we're not enforcing that contract. No. Another way to think about the distinction is process. It's the process is formation, and substance, which is like the agreement. So the process was wrong, the agreement was wrong. Process to make was wrong, the agreement was wrong. Restatement 12 is the capacity to contract. And it says, no one can be bound by contract who has no legal capacity to incur at least voidable contractual duties. Capacity to contract may be partial, and its existence in respect of a particular transaction may depend upon the nature of the transaction and upon other circumstances. So it doesn't necessarily void it, but it voidable. A natural person who manifests assent to a transaction has full legal capacity to incur contractual duties thereby, unless he is under guardianship, an infant, mentally ill, intoxicated. An infant is a loose term. Infant is like a child. Dodson v. Schrader, minor buying a car, he totals it, and then he asks, and then he like takes it back and is like, I can't enter a contract. I don't like the court's decision in this. Anyway, two minority rules. The first of these minority rules is called the benefit rule. The rule holds that upon rescission, which is the unwinding of a contract, recovery of the full purchase price is subject to a deduction of the minor's use of the merchandise. This rule recognizes that the traditional rule in regard to necessaries has been extended so far as to hold an infant bound by his contracts, where he failed to restore what he has received under them to the extent of the benefit actually derived by him from what he has received from the other party in the transaction. So this is my like favorite of the possible. If you're gonna say they can't, he at least needs to pay for what he destroyed. So if he takes it and brings it right back, nothing's wrong, then okay, still lame. But if he takes it, destroys it, yeah. The other minority rule holds that the minor's recovery of the full purchase price is subject to a deduction of the minor's use of the consideration he or she received under the contract, or for the depreciation or deterioration of the consideration of its process. So I just explained that as the benefit rule. No, the benefit rule is saying you got a benefit, so maybe if you use it for an hour, we charge you what Uber would, or a Zipcar, or we charge you like it was a rental. What's the difference? Benefit to the minor versus loss to the seller. So that's the difference. The benefit rule looks at the benefit to the minor. The depreciation rule looks at the loss to the seller, and in Dodson it was a big loss. Dodson v. Schrader, this rule is based upon the underlying purpose of the infancy doctrine, which is to protect minors from the lack of judgment and from squandering their wealth through improvident contracts with crafty adults who would take advantage of them in the marketplace. I think if someone's taking advantage of, there's a different issue. Anyway, rule adopted by the court. We state the rule to be followed hereafter in reference to a contract of a minor to be where a minor has not been overreached in any way, and there has been no undue influence, and the contract is fair and a reasonable one, and the minor has actually paid the money to the purchase price and taken the use of the article purchased, that he ought not be permitted to recover the amount actually paid, without allowing the vendor of the goods reasonable compensation for the use of, depreciation, and willful or negligent damage to the article purchased while in his hands. So that's basically like putting the two together. You're paying for your use and you're paying for the depreciation. If there has been any fraud or imposition on the part of the seller, or if the contract is unfair, or any unfair advantage has been taken of the minor, inducing him to make the purchase, then the rule does not apply. Which is just what we said. Fair. Restatement 14, infants. Unless a statute provides otherwise, a natural person has the capacity to incur only voidable contractual duties until the beginning of the day before the person's 18th birthday. I'm glad we cleared that up, because the day before the person's 18th birthday is apparently super important. The dominant view holds minor in restitution. So, in restitution is the benefit bestowed and retaining a benefit. Restatement 12, comment F, necessaries. A person having no capacity or limited capacity to contract. I'm in this room, I'm not supposed to be, so I'm like making sure no one needs it, because I need to leave if they do. A person having no capacity or limited capacity to contract are often liable for necessities furnished to them or to their wives or children. Though only treated as contractual, such liabilities are quasi-contractual. The liability is measured by the value of necessaries rather than by the terms of the promise. Totem Marine Tug and Barge v. Alaska Pipeline Service. So this is, now we're going into duress. So, I thought I had a hypo. No, that's later. Okay, so in this one, they were like tuna fishing or salmon fishing, and they went up and they had bad nets, and so instead of asking for new nets, even though I don't think they could have, it was only a month, they went on strike and they demanded more money, and the guy who was in charge was like, the liaison was like, I can't make that decision, and they were like, well, we're not doing anything until you can, and there was no one else to do the job, so he was forced to agree with them, and then they came back and he was like, but I don't agree, I can't do this, so they said it was duress. So duress exists where one party involuntarily accepted the terms of another, circumstances permitted no other alternative, and such circumstances were the result of coercive acts of the other party. So the guy agreed to the raise, but he had no other choice. He couldn't find other people to work. He needed them to crew the ships. He needed to get this stuff done, and the guys like put him in a position where like they were the only ones. So it was coercive. And then also, physical duress would mean the contract is just void. But economic duress is voidable, and it requires a wrongful act. One essential element of economic duress is that plaintiff shows that the other party, by wrongful acts or threats, intentionally caused him to involuntarily enter into a particular transaction. So, what's a wrongful act? The wrongful act must have caused the problem. Courts have not attempted to define exactly what constitutes a wrongful or coercive act, as wrongfulness depends on particular facts in each case. This requirement may be satisfied where the alleged wrongdoer's conduct is criminal or tortious, but an act or threat may also be considered wrongful if it is wrongful in a moral sense. Restatement 175, 1. If a party's manifestation of assent is induced by an improper threat by the other party that leaves the victim no reasonable alternative, the contract is voidable by the victim. So if the victim wants to keep it, then they can. But if he were like physically threatened, then it's just void. Like, so it's an improper or wrongful threat need not be illegal. It could be a threat to commit a tort or a crime. It could be threat of criminal prosecution, or it could be a threat to engage in litigation or refuse to pay a debt when doing so is in bad faith. Lack of reasonable alternative. Reasonable alternatives might include legal action, alternative sources of goods, services, and funds, toleration if threat is only a minor vexation. Threat must substantially contribute to the manifestation of assent. So in this case, the strike was like, that's why he offered more money. It was part and parcel. Subject to inquiry as to whether victim was in fact induced by the threat. So it's the inducement of the threat. Void versus voidable. Physical compulsion is void. Economic compulsion is voidable. Restatement 177, when undue influence makes a contract voidable. Undue influence is unfair persuasion. So that's duress. Duress is a manifestation of assent is induced by improper threat, no reasonable alternative, contract is voidable. But that's... okay. And then, so that's duress. Undue influence, though, is different, and that's Restatement 177, and undue influence says, undue influence is unfair persuasion of a party who is under the dominion of the person exercising the persuasion, or who by virtue of the relation between them is justified in assuming that the person will not act in a manner inconsistent with his welfare. So someone, Stockholm Syndrome, like you finally get to the point, they finally get to the point where they're like, this person wants my best, even though they do not. If a party's manifestation of assent is induced by undue influence by the other party, the contract is voidable. For the victim, problem if you have Stockholm Syndrome, because you're like, I don't want to avoid it. This person loves me, and he does not. This is Odorazzi. Okay, so this is old Odorazzi versus Bloomfield School District, where he was charged with a crime, and then the school board, like, or people came to his house and were like, oh, if you don't sign this and get fired and quit, then we're gonna put you through this thing and you'll never be hired again. And like, they came to his house in the middle of the night and like were there for hours, and it's like, what's going on? Was the contract invalid because of duress, fraud, mistake, or undue influence? The contract was invalid on account of undue influence. The defense, let's go through before we do that. One party involuntarily accepted the terms of another. Circumstances permitted no other alternative. Such circumstances were the result of coercive acts of the other party. Nah, probably no alternative, because they said, well, you could keep going. Alternative. Okay. So the answer is it was undue influence. The contract was invalid on account of undue influence. The defense of duress failed because there is no unlawful action. Okay, so no unlawful action. The defense of fraud failed because there was no allegation that there was a knowing misrepresentation. So like the school board thought they were saying correct things. The defense of mistake failed because there was no mistake of fact or law. However, the defense of undue influence could be successful. In essence, undue influence involves the use of excessive pressure to persuade one vulnerable to such pressure. Pressure applied by the dominant subject to a servient object. In combination, the element of undue susceptibility in the servient person and excessive pressure by the dominating person make the latter's influence undue. for it results in the apparent will of the servient person being in fact the will of the dominant person. This can be talked about as total weakness of mind or excessive strength by a dominant subject. Indications of undue influence: discussion of transaction at an unusual or inappropriate time, consummation of the transaction at an unusual place, like an employment agreement at your house, insistent demand that business be finished at once. Oh, if you don't do this now, we can't stop what's going to happen. Extreme emphasis on untoward consequences of delay. Oh, you're going to never get a job again if you don't do this right now. The use of multiple persuaders by the dominant side against a single servient party. They came in a group. Absence of third-party advisors to the servient party. Again, they're alone. Statements that there is no time to consult financial advisors or attorneys. Contrasting undue influence and duress. Was there duress present in Odorazi? It sounds like it. Sounds like it's a good case. Maybe. Was there improper threat? Okay, so there was undue influence, but was there duress? Which I kind of walked through. But was there improper threat? Was there a reasonable alternative? Did the threat induce dissent? Why pursue undue influence and not duress? Okay, because you didn't need to know. You didn't need to prove a wrongful threat, and probably they couldn't have, because it could what they were saying was true. They just they didn't need to go there. Anyway, what's the downside of undue influence? Well, it's difficult to prove dominance and susceptibility, which is why you have this laundry list of 7 things to they were alone. It was at night. They were pushing. There were 6 of them and 1 of them. They didn't give him time to have anyone else. Blah 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 blah. Sounds like police interrogations that go wrong. Last thing, undue influence is restatement 177. Required domination or relation. The rule stated in this section protects a person only if he is under the domination of another and is justified by virtue of his relationship with another in assuming that the other will not act inconsistently with his welfare. Relations that often fall within the rule include those of parent-child, husband and wife, clergyman and parishioner, and physician and patient. In each case, it is a question of fact whether the relation is such as to give undue weight to the other's attempts at persuasion. The required relation may be found in situations other than those enumerated. However, the mere fact that a party is weak, infirm, and aged does not in itself suffice, although it may be a factor in determining whether the required relation exists. Law review articles, undue influence, false confessions.